Hello, and welcome to our introduction to the proposed New York State Minimum Technical Standards. My name is Jason Larson, and I'm a member of the MTS Committee. What is MTS? So, the Minimum Technical Standards, or MTS, is a set of minimum standards for performing a survey and the preparations of the deliverables in the state of New York. The goal is to provide a legislated and enforceable rule set that all surveys in New York will adhere to. So why do we need MTS? So right off the bat, number one goal is to protect the welfare of the general public, to elevate the public's confidence in the land surveying profession, to revise and update the NYSAPLS Code of Practice and the State Board of Education practice guidelines. By doing this, we'll provide a unified standard of practice that is one stop for everyone to understand what's required. The standards will set a clear and measurable set of goals. And once again, these standards are such that they will be enforceable. One thing to note, New York, although we like to think of ourselves as leaders in many ways in the country, in this particular area, sadly, the surveying profession lags significantly behind almost every other state in the union that has long since mandated and legislated similar sets of standards. So we're playing a little bit of catch up here. So what's happened so far? So basically, back in 2017, the committee was formed as a result of a strategic planning retreat that was done by NYSAPLS. Once the committee was formed, we went off, worked on the standards for about 2 years, and we presented a draft to the board September 20th, 2019. So that was roughly about a year ago. Shortly thereafter, the board approved it in the sense that they wanted to open that up for the rest of the membership to see, and basically opened up a member comment period that ran all last fall up to just prior to the annual conference. At the annual conference, we had a membership discussion forum that was held at the end of the conference, and that conference was also, in fact, open. The forum was open to non-NYSAPLS members as well, because these standards will ultimately affect any surveyor in the state of New York. So that was quite well attended. I think there was about 60 or 70 people in attendance, both members and non-members. From February of June of this year, we took the various feedback and revised our document, revised in some cases and mostly clarified what was in there based on those comments. That revised document was then again shared with the board and the membership at the end of June. And here we are today. We're preparing this introduction webinar that's going to be open to all, such that it will prepare people because at the end of the month, we're going to open up the polls to allow the membership to vote for acceptance of these standards to be able to move on to the next step. And that'll run about a 2-week period between at the end of September through the beginning of October. So how was the committee formed and who's on it? So as I mentioned, the committee was formed at the end of 2017 as a result of the strategic planning retreat. There was seen a need to push ahead with this, trying to get these standards passed. There was an attempt to do this 20 some odd years ago that ran into a lot of opposition, and it just kind of went round and round and eventually sort of died. But everybody now feels like the time is right, that this is something we can move forward. So the committee was selected primarily based on interest of those that wanted to serve on the committee, but then also with an eye towards statewide representation. Uh, One of the things about New York State is we're a quite large state, and so we wanted to make sure that we covered the state with representation. And so the members on the committee, currently there's seven of us currently serving on the committee. Roy Garfinkel is the chair. He's up in the Rochester area. Scott Allen, myself, Tom Merrill, Jim Vienna, Dan Weaver, and Marshall Wilson. Past members include Frank Fianterolo, John McIntosh Jr., Dave Zacharias, and Dave Ziegler. We've shown their locations as well on here, but as I mentioned, those guys unfortunately are no longer serving on the committee. But one thing you can see by the map here is that we have a pretty diverse spread. We pretty much have geographic locations, at least for covering pretty much the entire state. And, how was this document developed? So the MTS committee would typically meet via teleconference at least once a month, if not every couple of weeks, for the course of 2 years to discuss and debate the content. We started with the NYSAPLS Guide of Practice as a starting point, and we revised from there. So that's a lot of the things that are in our standards should be familiar to most folks that have read our practice guidelines for the association. And as I mentioned, the state of New York is large and diverse. We have the biggest city in the country, and we have very rural areas as well. And so coming up with standards to cover everyone was always going to be a tall challenge. But I think what we've done is struck a decent compromise, trying to keep in mind myself. I work in I'm in Midtown Manhattan, so I'm fully cognizant of what's going on in New York City and the metro area. We have another member, Dan Weaver, that's out on Long Island, out in Hampton. So, we kind of cover the downstate area. Plus, we have lots of upstate folks as well on the committee. So, there's a big discrepancy between how things operate in different areas of the state, and that's fine. Local practice is a very common theme throughout surveying as a profession in general across the entire country. So we obviously have to take into account those things, but at the same time, there are certain things that everyone should be doing regardless of where you're working, and largely are for the most part. So the major milestones that we've achieved so far, plus here's some of the things that are coming up. So initially we developed the standards, so that one's done. Obtain the acceptance of the NYSAPLS Board of Directors on behalf of the memberships. That was done again about a year ago. We then solicited membership comment and revised and clarified the MTS based on those responses. That is also complete at this stage. The next step, and as I briefly mentioned earlier, the next step is to actually get the membership at large to vote for acceptance of the standards. And then once we obtain that, then we will present the State Board of Education and Office of Professions our documents with the eye towards adoption and moving it towards legislation. So throughout this process, we obviously have heard from lots of folks regarding our efforts here, and we just have a couple quotes which are longer than I would have liked. We sort of solicited these comments, and I was kind of looking for one or two sentences, but obviously there's people who are very passionate about this stuff. And so I'm not necessarily going to read through each of these, but you can certainly read through them as you go. Very good quote here from Gary Kent, who many of you should be familiar with if you've attended the annual conference at all. He, pretty much every time does a series of lectures and is very well respected throughout the country. So he's got his comments here. John McIntosh III, his father actually served on this committee, as you can see by this quote, and sadly passed away this last year. But very, very influential on the committee. Was licensed in a number of states, and so obviously had quite a broad perspective when it came to how standards were applied in other areas, as well as here in New York State. Brian Babcock, he's actually the president of the regional of which I'm a member of, which is the Delaware Hudson Valley Regional. Also has some lovely things here to say. More downstate, Hudson Valley sort of area. And then lastly, Neil Kleckty. He again has some great things to say here. All right, so to the meat. So let's talk a little bit about the content of the standards themselves. And these are some of the frequently asked questions. These are, a lot of them are based on the comments that we received during the comment period. And so we felt like it would be useful to discuss some of these things. So I'm not going to go through the entire standard. I'll leave that to everyone to read on their own. And you should. If you have not read through the standards yet, I would definitely suggest pausing this video and doing so that you can come to your own questions and comments. Probably going to be similar to some that we're going to go over here momentarily. But the document itself is broken down into these 9 sections, 10 sections actually, if you include the purpose. Pretty comprehensive, covers pretty much all areas of our profession in producing surveys. So on to our first question. So one thing that we got from a number of people is why define other types of surveys, such as topographical surveys? And this comes down, primarily the question is coming from the fact that here in New York State, boundary surveys are the only type of surveys that actually require a licensed land surveyor to perform them. Other types of surveys can in fact be signed and sealed by civil engineers or other folks. And so we wanted to basically define what a boundary survey is and what it isn't. And the goal here as well is, it's kind of our opinion that why don't quote unquote surveys require a surveyor to oversee a licensed surveyor? And so by defining these other types, this sort of sets the stage for inclusion of these other types of surveys within our profession's control and oversight. That's sort of a future goal. But one that I think would be advantageous for our profession to, sort of take control of these other types of surveys, because there is a lot of encroachment from other professions, but then other random people coming in as technology has advanced, and things that used to be very expensive or very highly technical to do. You would kind of need a surveyor to do them just because of the nature of it. But these days, everybody's smartphone has got GPS built into it. So, we think it's a good idea to try and pull these things within our professional control as they apply to real surveys. You don't want people out there doing what they're professing to be a real survey when they're not actually licensed. And it also helps other professions to understand our profession a little bit better. I constantly am bombarded by folks using the word survey in the context of other things that are not what we would typically call a survey. In the engineering fields or even architecture, a lot of times I'll hear people use the word survey, but what they really mean is more of like an inspection sort of thing. And so it's our intent here as well to, by defining these types of surveys, to actually lay claim to that word a little bit, and make it a little more official, and thereby elevate our profession a little bit more. All right, next, what if a survey does not fall under this list, under any one of these predefined types of surveys within the standards? So the defined survey types that we've prepared here cover most situations. Basically, you know, most surveys from type to type, they're going to fall within one of these categories. But every now and then you do run into a situation where it just doesn't quite live up to that full title. And so we don't necessarily want to force people into one of those pigeonholes. And so what we've done is provided a specific purpose survey type that basically covers those sort of outliers. And the idea here is, if you have a specific scope that is very unique or specialized for some reason, essentially that type of survey really just requires you to call it a specific purpose survey. You're doing a survey for a specific purpose. It really only requires you to state what the purpose and intent of the work is on the face of the drawing or in the report or whatever it is that you're preparing. And so you kind of get around it that way. I will also note, though, that this is not meant to be used as a loophole to get around the requirements of the other survey types. And so, you wouldn't want to use this specific purpose survey to, say, circumvent, a full-blown boundary survey effort, for instance. Okay, so where did the classification of survey by land use and relative precision tables derive from? So this is in the precision and accuracy section. And essentially these categories and things, it's the urban, suburban, rural categories. These are very commonly used within national standards and standards within other states. So these should be very familiar to most people. And I would mention too that these standards, again, because keeping in mind that this is the minimum technical standards, this is setting the low bar. This is setting the bar that you, at a minimum, have to meet these requirements. And I will say that they are fairly minimal. My personal opinion is that these standards, the required accuracies and precisions, are on the low side compared to today's equipment and procedures. You should be able to easily meet these requirements as long as you're doing the using proper technique and things like that. There shouldn't be any issue here. But basically, they're based, those categories and everything. If, for instance, you look at the national NSPS and the ALTA standards, they basically use the same language. All right, so what if there are changes to datums or the ALTA NSPS standards or other sort of standards that we are referencing within the document? Not that we're using those standards, but we often will refer to things. But datums, for instance, we have a big datum change coming up in a couple years from NGS. And so, well, what do we do about that? If we set this into law, how do we change the law to account for these other changes? Well, first of all, the goal here, when we do go to get this legislated, the actual MTS document itself, the actual guidelines, are going to be a set of regulations within the State Board of Education. So regulations are much easier to change than actual laws. So what the law part that we're going to do is we're going to go get a law that basically gives State Board of Education the authority to administer these regulations as well as enforce them. And essentially the law is just going to say you have to follow MTS as presented by the State Board of Education. That's pretty much going to be it for the law. The law is relatively difficult to change. Getting things through the legislature obviously becomes a political thing and everything else, and so we want to avoid that. The idea with MTS is that this is meant to be a living document We don't want to get ourselves boxed into a corner where, we think these standards are perfect. Nothing's ever perfect, and so we want to be able to change them as need be in the future. If problems or things that we didn't foresee come up, we want to be able to change those. And so basically, that's why we're approaching it within this way. Set it up as a regulation, and then the regulations. There's still a process to update the regulations. It's just not quite as stringent as going through the full legislative change. So that's how that's going to be handled in the future. All right. So another question that came up is, will all boundary work performed require a map? Short answer here is no. Some language in the MTS document was revised to make this a little bit clearer. Mainly, this is a contractual issue that you should work out with your client. And basically all we're saying, because there's a lot of standards that have to do with your maps within MTS. And so all we're really saying is if a map is prepared, these standards are what are going to apply to that map. So we're not necessarily saying you have to do a map. There are surveys for sure where you're generating a report or something like that. And we address some of those. We have some standards in there about that as well, but we're not basically mandating that you make a map per se. All right, so here we go. This is the big hot topic. This is by far the biggest issue that's come up in the course of presenting these standards. And part of the standard is that we are mandating that property corners, monuments for property corners are to be set. And so why is this, and how did we get to that determination? So it's our belief that providing a physical representation of the boundary in the client to the client and their adjoiners is a good idea. It provides retraceability for following surveyors. So if you want to follow in the footsteps, you have to have something to follow behind. And if there's no physical evidence left behind by a surveyor, then that makes that process very difficult. It provides for surveyor accountability. One of the things that we're asking for is that the corners that are set have a cap or stamping if you're doing some sort of monument or disc that identifies who set it. So you can then see who it was that put that corner in the ground, and you can potentially call them up and talk to them. Say you disagree with where that corner is set. It's always a good idea to talk to our fellow professionals in the areas that we're working on, and having those names and PLS numbers and things like that, business names, allow those communications to happen a little bit easier and better. So it also means that if you're out there, dropping corners in willy-nilly, then that's going to be known too, is who's putting less effort into their boundary work. It meets landowners' expectations. Most landowners expect when they get a survey done that they're gonna have their property corners marked, and particularly upstate and rural areas, this is more common in suburban and rural areas. That's just sort of common expectation, throughout the rest of the country as well. That's pretty much part of the deal generally, and so that's what we're trying to achieve here in New York as well. One of the other things is it provides the orderly erection of improvements near boundary lines. So if somebody wants to go and build a fence, having those physical marks there is kind of important so that they put their fence on the right side of the line, and they don't create boundary disputes with their neighbors. Obviously, that's something that we all want to avoid. And again, like I said, this is commonly accepted practice throughout the rest of the country. It's sort of just automatic that's part of what we do. And this is not new. I mean, there are, even here in New York State, there's lots of precedent going back in time for setting monuments of some sort to mark boundary lines. So am I required to set monuments in all situations? Short answer here is yes. You are required to set monuments in all situations. There's no waiver New Jersey, for instance, when they adopted their standards, they asked everybody to set boundary corners, but then they also provided a waiver form that says, okay, if the client doesn't want it, you don't have to do it as long as you get them to sign this piece of paper. And what happened? Every surveyor that didn't want to set corners, that's the first thing they do is they get their client to sign that piece of paper, and it gets them off the hook. And so we saw that as a giant loophole and basically circumvented the entire purpose. So we have not included a waiver path within our standards. What we did do, though, however, is obviously we understand that there are situations that make setting of monuments very difficult. An example here I've got shown on the screen. This is just a screen capture of Midtown Manhattan, and obviously most of Manhattan is covered wall to wall with buildings, and they occupy the entirety of the parcel that they sit on, and so trying to set a corner on a lot like that is basically impossible. And so what do you do in those situations? So we have provided within the standards methods for dealing with this sort of situation. So further along that idea, how will monuments be set in urban areas with building or other sort of obstruction issues? So the idea is you set corners everywhere where they're not where they are physically unobstructed. So as long as you're able to set the corner, you shall, I should say. Where they can't be set due to some physical obstruction, you got a couple different options here. One is you can set witness corners. In the initial draft of this standard, we were relying heavily on setting of witness corners, and a lot of people brought up issues with that, which we thought about, but it certainly the more you dig into it and you really think about, all right, well, how are we actually going to do this? We ran into some issues with it, so we've revised it a bit, easing off of some of the requirements for telling people they had to set witness corners. What we've done in addition, and actually this was in there originally as well, but another option is you can, if you can't or don't want to set witness corners for various reasons, the other option you have is to publish at least 3 control points that are geometrically tied to the survey. And so what does that mean? So an example could be if you have a 4-sided lot and you can go set 3 of the corners, but the 4th one, there's a wall there, or there's a building corner there, or there's a giant rock outcropping, or something is physically obstructing where you want to put the corner. Well, you can actually just publish geometry for your other 3 corners. The other corners can in fact be the control points, as long as you have geometry shown to tie in where that 4th point would be if you could set it. How about Manhattan, where you've got, there's just the whole lot is being covered by a building and you can't set any of the corners? Well, in that case, again, you can just set 3 control points out in the street or along the sidewalk or whatever, as long as there are published coordinates or geometry or ties or something. You have to have at least 3, and they're tied to your actual boundary determination, so that the idea with all of setting monuments here is so that following surveyors can take your survey and fix it to the ground. Because I see lots of surveys that are published in the city, Long Island, lower upstate areas, mid Hudson Valley, things like that, where you get a pretty map, it's got geometry on it, but there's no monuments, there's no tie to any sort of physical structure other than maybe the building, which is often just sort of swing ties to maybe the nearest tenth or the nearest foot for that matter. I've seen those. So trying to actually get that boundary established on the ground accurately is really not a practical thing, based on that sort of deliverable. So having those physical representations on the ground are super important. So another issue that comes up, this has actually been a national debate for quite a while. So as other states, like I said, a lot of other states have required this for a long time. And one of the things that always comes up and says, okay, we're going to mandate everybody set corners. And does that mean that if I go out and make my boundary determination and I find other corners there, but I don't agree with them, and so I'm going to come over here and I'm going to set my corner in where I say the corner is. I'm going to set my monument. And here's a few examples here on the screen. You got literally rebar and cap, a tenth apart, or some old pipes and a rebar sitting there that's obviously newer. This is kind of crazy. Why would you do this? Well, the standards are written in such a way that, if you find other physical evidence, other monuments that are set at or about the corner, we are certainly not suggesting that you still have to set your own point at the exact location that you've determined your boundary to be. You can actually just reference these other monuments, again, with geometry to tie it into your boundary determination. And so then that becomes a bit of a question. It's like, okay, well, how big of a radius around my corner is too big? How far do I have to be away from an existing monument before I have to start setting my own corner? And basically what we're telling everybody there is that's going to have to be up to your professional discretion and decision. That exact number, it could also depend greatly on where you're at. If you're out upstate somewhere out in the middle of the woods and you've got a corner within, 2 or 3 feet maybe, you might say that's good enough and you just tie it to your boundary and it's fine. If you go in again in Midtown Manhattan, 2 or 3 feet's a lot, in those situations. So you really want, it sort of depends heavily on your location and I hate to say this, but the property value often will change that attitude largely as well. So you have to basically look at the situation and determine for yourself, how far away is too far away before you have to set your own corner. Um, that's assuming that there's another corner there in the general vicinity. If there's nothing there, you still got to set a corner. So this is, again, not necessarily an out for having to not set corners. You still have to set a corner, but if there's other evidence that's already there, we would like to avoid the pincushion effect, and basically just say, okay, provide geometry to these other found monuments and then call it good and not set an additional point. That having one corner with 4 or 5 monuments in a close proximity is kind of crazy. All right, this is another one actually. A lot of the guys who are working in the mortgage survey or title survey sort of market, cost is a touchy topic, and it's like, okay, well, how do I justify this extra cost to my client? Lawyers and title people and bank mortgage companies, they are very cost sensitive. And, basically, again, here, if this is going to end up being legislated, and the answer is easy. The what you tell your client is the state law requires this extra level of effort, and there's an additional cost for it. It's just that simple. The business owner has to explain to their client, that their services have to comply with the law. So, that to me is a pretty easy argument to make. Those clients aren't necessarily going to be happy about it, but the fact of the matter is if as long as everyone is following the law, then everybody's doing the same thing. There shouldn't be an issue with folks being undercut because they're not doing what they're supposed to do. If they are, then they can be held accountable for that separately through the profession. If people are found to not be doing what they're supposed to be doing and undercutting their fellow professionals, then then we can deal with that because it's going to be a state law at that stage. Another question. So this comes down to subdivisions, and again, this was one of these topics that we had a lot of discussion within the committee about because. And again, this is going to be more in your suburban and rural areas, where private development is still active. You go out, you design a big fancy brand new subdivision, and assuming the developer is on top of it, they run out there, they build all the roads, and they start building houses right away. Um, in other states, personally, I was originally licensed in Florida, so I ran into a lot of this sort of activity where way back in the day, their state law in Florida was such that you were required to set those corners pretty much at the beginning of the subdivision. And in some cases, it varied by county, but in some cases, the county would require you to set those corners prior to the plat being recorded, the map being recorded. So, invariably, what would happen would be those original monuments would get knocked out immediately during construction, and so that's kind of silly. So what we've decided to do here is basically leave it open to essentially as a contractual issue between the surveyor and their client, typically the developer or the contractor. And so they just basically need to be on the same page as to when those corners get set. The requirement in the standard is going to be that the original corners are only going to be required to be set at the first conveyance of each lot. So theoretically, when they go out, the lot is built upon. They're selling it to the first homeowner. At that stage, that's when that lot is required to be staked and pinned. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the original surveyor. It could be a different surveyor, because we also acknowledge that there are situations where subdivisions don't get built right away. They may go get recorded and sit around for 20 years before the developer decides the time is right to actually build out that subdivision. Sometimes they do it under speculation where they're thinking, okay, let's go design this, let's get it all recorded and everything, but then maybe the market is down and they decide they don't actually want to try and build in that environment. So the original surveyor doesn't necessarily want to be on the hook for 20 years waiting to set these corners. And so we're saying that, okay, it doesn't have to be the original surveyor. So again, that just kind of comes down to a contractual issue between you and your client at that stage. So determine whether or not it makes sense to set those now or by the original surveyor or later by some other surveyor when the lots actually get built and sold to private third parties. All right, so will these standards put NYSAPLS members in a financial disadvantage against non-members? So this really kind of comes down to primarily the boundary corner discussion, but part of it comes from the fact that our current NYSAPLS practice guidelines do state that you're supposed to be setting boundary corners to be a member in good standing. And so the idea here would be okay, if the NYSAPLS members are required to do it, but then there are other people who are not, then that's going to cause a problem. It's a problem now. It's a current problem. So basically, we say no, that these standards are not going to be a NYSAPLS thing. This is going to be, we're doing it through NYSAPLS because we're the ones who are pushing this to be done in the first place. But once it gets legislated, it's not going to just be a NYSAPLS thing. It's going to be a requirement for all licensed surveyors within the state, whether or not they're a member of NYSAPLS. So basically, the answer to this question is no. Everybody, all surveyors in the state of New York are going to be held to the same set of guidelines. And so NYSAPL members are not going to be affected or put at a disadvantage because of these standards. So why change the required certification, and will there be issues with the title companies and attorneys? And so in the current guidelines, the practice guidelines, there's a lot of language in there about certifications and things that you have to put on the face of your drawings and all that. We actually removed a lot of that, and basically in an effort to try and simplify it. Essentially the technical criteria for surveying is going to be handled by the MTS. And so as long as you certify that the survey was performed following MTS, that it meets the minimum technical standards, that's all that you're going to be required to do from an MTS standpoint. Everything else is left to the surveyor and their client to work out. So title companies and attorneys and everybody, a lot of times they'll have their own certifications that they want to see on the face of the drawing. And so we don't want to preclude that. We want to have that flexibility. And so those things, again, will just be worked out between the surveyor and their clients. And with that, I want to close it down. I'd like to thank everybody for your time and consideration. Hopefully this provides a bit of background for you to be able to make an informed decision when you go to vote. I encourage everyone to vote, not only on the MTS standards, but then also in November. Obviously, there's another election coming up that's pretty important. And so I would certainly encourage everyone to vote in that as well. But with that, we'll close it down and thank everyone for their time.